Hello, everybody. Welcome to Soundwave, where we are changing and transforming the world, our workplaces, our communities, and friends and families, one voice at a time. Welcome to Own Your Conversation. And this is a series, created for all of you Soundwave Global coaches out there, and also for the Soundwave fans, the enthusiasts, and for those folks of you, who have done the Soundwave assessments. And of course, for those of you who's wondering what this is all about, this is a series, is also for you. It's for everyone, where we all can learn about Soundwave, the strategies, the tips, and the tricks on how to skillfully use our voice, target our talk, and engage the people around us. And as we say here around Soundwave, when we are able to initiate great conversations between people, we are able to shift the dialogue, change the conversation, and shape the culture and outcomes that we want. Hello, everybody. My name is Kim Pong, and I am the global partner of Soundwave. And together with me, hosting this program is none other than Mr. Soundwave himself, Kevin Eyre. A very good morning to you, Kevin. How are you?
Good morning, Kim Pong. Very nice to see you. I'm well, thanks. I'm calling you from Bristol in the southwest of England, for those of you who know it, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Fantastic. Now, is it cold right now where you are at? I know how cold, how hot, what's going on in Bristol right now in the weather?
It's actually it's mild and wintry and wet. We have a storm is taking it too far, but it's very wet and windy there.
Well, I mean,
And
if I were you, I would exchange your weather anytime for the Singapore weather, because it's just humid and hot. Although, having said that, to be kind, the last couple of weeks has been a little bit kinder to us, than usually for most parts of the year.
I'm
Yeah.
pleased to hear retrospective weather forecast.
So with that, let's get started right now. Kevin, when you and I we were organizing this talk series here, we were kind of struggling a little bit with the title, and we decided eventually that the title, for this series is going to be called "Own Your Conversation," and we got really kind of excited about this title here. And I'd love to hear from you right now, right? Why is owning our conversation, such an important thing?
I think it's an important title, Kim Pong, because as we'll hear probably many times through this talk series, our conversations tend to be quite habitual. We learn to speak pretty early on in life, and we just carry on talking,
Hmm.
and we develop a unique style. No two people sound the same, but conversations have consequences.
Hmm.
When we're talking to people, the way we talk, what we say, and how we say it has an impact.
Hmm.
And so I think our title of Own the Conversation is really a message to people, which is the more you're aware, the more you understand the intricacies of the way in which you talk, the better control you can have over it,
Hmm.
and the more constructive and positive the outcomes you can have in conversation with people. So we're sort of encouraging people to really understand the way they talk, the unique way they talk, and to exercise control over that. So our strap line for this is Own Your Conversation.
Wow, I like that really much, right? And that this I remember some time back when we were just talking with one another, and we were running, folks through the Soundwave accreditation programs. One of the things that came up for me, during those sessions was this idea that talk is action, right? And talk is not just talk, but talk in fact is action. Now, and the first time when I heard it, it took me a little while to kind of wrap my mind around that idea. So, share with us here a little bit more, right? When we say talk is action in the Soundwave context, what are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about situations where the language does the doing. A great example, a typical example, and the person who started this off was a philosopher called John Searle. And Searle provides a really great example of a promise.
Okay.
When somebody makes a promise to somebody, they're not really doing anything other than talking. The entire act is situated inside the promise that somebody makes to somebody else. And so the talk is the action.
Hmm.
It's interesting sometimes in our work with organizations, people get quite fixated on actions and behaviors. And the moment you start to have a conversation about, so how are you going to deliver this action or this behavior? At least a part of any action, almost any action, and
Mhm.
certainly interacting in organizations, has to involve talk to some degree. It might sometimes be 100% of the action, like a promise. it might be 10% of the action, but it's very difficult to do anything without talk being involved. So that's really what we mean by the idea of talk is action.
Mhm.
I hope after you first heard it, Kim Pong, it gradually became something that sunk in and made perfect sense to you.
Yeah, it did. Well, actually, when I first realized what it was all about, right, it actually did more to me in terms of getting me to be a lot more concerned about the way I talk, right? Because very often, I don't really think about how I talk, I just talk. But then when we begin to talk about this whole idea that talk is action, suddenly the way we talk, spins off a different meaning altogether. Because all of a sudden, I realize now everything that we do is about the conversations that we have, right? Leadership is conversation, relationship is conversation, culture is conversation. And I guess that's the reason why we are here today running this series here, for the benefit of our coaches, for our fans, for those people that have done the assessments. And the whole idea is really this, right? That if we are aware of how we talk and how we have conversations with one another, it really is possible, isn't it, right? To change the world, transform the world, one voice at a time. You are watching Own Your Conversation series from Soundwave here, and this is the first of the 10-part series here where we're going to be talking about the 9 verbal strategies of Soundwave. And today we are just doing a overarching introduction of Soundwave, what it is all about, what are the voices, what are the styles here. And if you want to be informed of the series that are coming up as and when they are posted, go ahead, and subscribe to this channel here. Just go ahead and click on the subscribe button. And if you want to be notified every time a new series comes out or a new episode comes out, go ahead, click on the bell, and then we will send you the notification every time a new episode is posted. Together with me right now is Kevin, of course. And Kevin, I just want to take up from where we left off just now in our conversation. Now, very often the way we talk is habitual. There's a preferred way in the way we talk to people, isn't it? And very often we are not very mindful or even conscious about it. So I mean, I could almost imagine that if I close my eyes and I think about different friends of mine, different clients of mine, the way they talk is very much the same. They don't change. They hardly change. In fact, some of the friends I have for many, many years, they don't really change the way they talk. So what is this all about? Why are we so fixated, in the way we talk? Why are we so fixated in the way, we have our preferences in talking to people?
Okay, so I think that everybody has a particular style. I mean, for the time in which we have known each other, you're very familiar by now with the way in which I go about ordinary conversation. And it's true that there is something fundamental about each of us, which means that we speak in particular ways.
Mm-hmm.
However, people do change the way they talk, and they change the way they talk, particularly in any given situation, any given social context. So in simple terms, I'm likely to speak slightly differently to my boss than I might speak to my team members. I'll probably speak differently to my parents than I would do to my children. And these things we take very much for granted. And so although we have a particular style, we adapt how we talk to situation. Now, again, a lot of that is habitual. It's learned in family context, in educational and in working contexts. But we don't have to simply respond to the situation to change the way we talk. We can make small leaps of imagination. And for example, I could speak to my parents as if they were my children. They probably wouldn't appreciate it very much, but it's perfectly possible for me to do so. I'd have to be mindful of the fact that I'm breaking a whole set of social conventions in doing it, but it's not impossible. But what I could do is to tweak a little bit the way I talk to them, and I'd have a different effect as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
So to come back to your point, Kim Pong, yes, there is a particular way, a preference, a style that most of us have that we've developed over many years, but it's also possible, because we do, empirically we do, change the way we talk depending on who we're talking to.
Mhm. I mean, I totally resonate with what you were saying, that we talk differently to different people. Um, and I mean, very often, most of us are not very conscious, right, in how we actually talk differently to different people. I guess my point is this, right? Um, why is it that we are so locked into that manner of speaking to people or talking to people? I mean, if I'm talking to my boss, I'm talking to him or her that style. If I'm talking to my, my subordinates, I'm talking to them to a different style, or somebody else is a different style. Why is it that we are so fixed on that different way of talking? Is it possible for us to be able to change, the way we talk intentionally, with different people under different situation and under different circumstances?
Well, I think probably if you think about your own professional life, you'll recognize that as a coach,
Hmm.
when you go into coaching situations, you speak differently.
Yeah.
You have learnt the ways, the manners, the techniques, the styles that are appropriate in that situation.
Hmm.
And so the situation has a very big bearing on when and how we change the way we talk. But as I said a moment ago, we don't have to be driven by only situation. We can consciously decide to change the way we talk to get a different type of outcome.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think that to say why are we so embedded in a particular style, I think the issue about conversation is that it is fast and fluid, and so when we're in the middle of it, we just carry on talking, and we actually don't have time
Hmm.
to analyze the way we're talking while we're talking. Very often, we really have to stand back from it in order to make sense of what's going on.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And today, what we are doing here is to really give, that the introduction of this, 10-part series on the 9 verbal strategies of our voices here. And we are talking, it is so important to recognize that, hey, while the way we talk may be fixated and preferred, talk is not necessarily fixed, but talk is actually extremely fluid, right? And it's all about having that ability to be able to skillfully have a dialogue with people, have great conversations with people. And that's the reason why Soundwave exists, to help millions of people around the world just to do this, right? Now, and right now, what I like to do, Kevin, is to introduce Soundwave's 3 clusters of verbal styles here, if I may. So, if you think a little bit about it, right, the way we talk, essentially, it's really around 3 different verbal styles here, right? And it's the way we ask, the way we suggest, and the way we tell. And within the ask category, there are essentially 3 different voices, as we all know: the way we inquire, the way we probe, and the way we diagnose, right? And the way under the tell cluster, it is about how do we critique, how do we correct, and how do we challenge. And last but not least, of course, in the suggest category, we have how do we articulate, how do we advise, and how do we advocate. Now, this was really interesting for me because the first time when I, stumbled upon Soundwave years ago, right, and I realized, my gosh, there are 3 different ways of talking: the way I ask, the way I suggest, the way I tell. Kevin, I just I just went something like, my gosh, I didn't realize that I'm doing this 3 different styles all the time. And all of a sudden, it just made me realize that, my gosh, I am doing a lot of one clusters more compared to some other clusters here. How's that like in your own personal experience when you came across these 3 different ways of talking? What's your experience like in this space here?
Well, I think the first thing to say about this framework, Kim Pong, is that it's very simple. We don't want it to be overly simplistic. That's different, but it is simple, and it's a way of helping people just tune in the first instance and make sense of how they might be talking
Hmm.
and the impact it's having, and equally how other people might be talking. So we might come away from conversations with people feeling, a bit drained because all we've been getting from them is lots of opinions and suggestions about
Hmm.
what we might do. We might come away from a conversation with somebody else and feel really quite connected as a result. That's because the person seems to have been asking us lots of questions, taking an interest in us. And then we might come away from a conversation with somebody else feeling a little bit on the back foot, as if we've been, maybe just treated or spoken to a little harshly, a little directly, and that might be because we've been more instructed by somebody. Now, those really simple things have quite a bearing on how we feel about the person and about the relationship. It's not really necessary to become too much more analytical. Even if we work with these three concepts, we can start to make sense of what we're doing and what other people are doing. And so I think it's a helpful framework and a helpful model from that point of time. And judging by what you were saying in your introduction thing, Kim Pong, I'm sort of sensing that maybe was the effect it had on you when you first came across it.
Yeah, I mean, well, see, this is the thing I really appreciate about Soundwave, Kevin. It makes it so accessible and so easy to understand. It wasn't some technical mumbo jumbos, right? But it was so I guess the word I use is so earthy. It's so so on the ground, right? That it really challenged me to figure out, how do I ask questions? How do I make suggestions, and how do I tell, right? When I think about my wife, I think about my children, I think about my subordinates, I think about my colleagues, I think about my customers. The way we talk, everybody has different emphasis on this, right? And I found that to be extremely helpful. And I want to do a little bit more on figuring out a little bit more, right, on this ask, suggest, and tell thing, for the benefit of our listeners here. But before we go into that, this is really more a question for our coaches, and it's I think a lot of coaches very often loves to understand a little bit about, hey, where did Soundwave come from? How did Soundwave figure out all these different ideas and frameworks and all that, right? Now, I'm very aware that I'm speaking to the creator himself here, right? So I'm going to ask you the question, right? How did Soundwave come about, right? So very briefly, walk us through a little bit on, what brought you to discovering Soundwave, and what happened along the way that it became what it is today.
Okay, so my question for you, first of all, Kim Pong, is: do you want this to be a mumbo jumbo response or an earthy response?
Give me an earthy response. Give me something that people could take home and show it to their mother-in-laws, right? Yeah.
Okay. So, like all little creations, at one level they tend to emerge. Okay, and in a sense, Soundwave emerged, but it emerged as a consequence of a little bit of frustration. And one of those points of frustration was what I think tends to be a complete obsession in the world of managing, with looking at behavior. At one level, as if we're sort of chimpanzees, and we're pretty close to chimpanzees, but as if we're observing chimpanzees and judging their behavior. Very good. See, 99% of the things are the same. And what occurred to me was that's not really what happens when people interact. What happens when people interact is that, of course, there are gestures. There are a lot of them going on in this conversation now. There is this thing called body language, which I think is important, but perhaps overstated. And it's a little bit going back to the talk is action concept we spoke about earlier in this talk.
Yeah.
That actually there isn't really any human interaction without talk, without conversation. And yet, when you look at the literature, particularly the psychological literature, there's a disproportionate unemphasis, if that's the right word. There's insufficient emphasis given to the power that talk and conversation has. And so that was very much the idea in the background. And then there were a few other triggers, some academic work by Sengi, for example, who talked about managers advocating too much and inquiring too little. And that was a provocation to start to ask the question, well, is that really what managers do? And is it what people do, but particularly is it managers? And it's probably worth saying that a lot of the thinking and the work and the origins of Soundwave comes out of the context of organizational life, people's professional lives. And that, of course, is different from family life. Okay, there will be some nuances that are different there. So, I could get into lots of mumbo jumbo at this point. I'll try and keep it earthy. It emerged, and it emerged partly as a consequence of frustration and also through a provocation, which was, what's this thing about inquiry and advocacy? Is this all that managers do? And of course, it's not. We do much more than that. We do much more than ask tell, and suggest. And as we look at the sound wave model, that breaks it down further. But if we wanted to, we wouldn't have to stop at 9 voices. We could go further than that. But it's a case of what the human mind can cope with. And I suppose my final point here is remembering 3 things is easy to do. Yeah. I can remember the idea of ask, suggest, and tell, and I can work with that, and I can do things with it. Yeah. So does that help answer your question, Kim Pong?
Yeah, of course. And I thought it was a really clever idea, right? To kind of think in terms of that 3 clusters: ask, suggest, and tell, and then think in terms of the 3 voices across the 3 clusters here. I thought it was just simply brilliant. I'm saying this as a matter of a practitioner here, right? I use this, for my coaching. I use this for, running workshops around Asia, helping leaders come together, helping teams work together better, helping people create a culture of psychological safety and all that around the voices, that we use. And I just am extremely grateful to Soundwave, for creating that concept where we could easily just share with people, coach people, and they go like, yeah, why didn't I think of that, right? It is so easy to understand. It's almost second nature and intuitive here. And this is what I like to do the segue into the next segment here, right? And the more we realize about how we talk, the more we realize about how we are not able to talk in certain ways, we cannot run away from the simple conclusion, right? Which essentially is this: how we talk actually impacts and affects people around us in the way they think, in the way they feel, in the way we behave. So in some way, we talk a lot about the skillful ability of using our voices and the unskillful abilities of using our voices here, right? So Kevin, if you could just share with us, to our coaches and to our audience out there, what is the difference between, or rather, what's a skillful use of a voice versus an unskillful, and essentially, what is the differences in the outcomes in those 2 different ways of using the voices?
Okay, so it's interesting. I think there are a number of ways of approaching this question, Kim Pong. I think the easiest way to do it is to think about someone doing too much of something or too little. So skillful use, I think I'd distinguish between skillful use and timely use. So skillful use, say, I might, for instance, be interested in something you're doing, and actually something you're doing might be really important to me. And so I get a little bit excited and carried away. And instead of asking you 1 or 2 questions, engaging your interest in exchanging with me, I might move to ask 6 or 7 questions in rapid succession. And your experience of me then moves from Kevin's interested and he's asking me some good inquiring questions to feels like Kevin's interrogating me. So whereas the first of those would be skillful use, proportionate, appropriate number of questions to suit your interest and sensitivity to the conversation at hand, if I up the ante and I just start to ask lots of questions in rapid succession, then your experience of me is fundamentally different. And that would be unskillful type of asking, and more specifically an unskillful use of inquiry. But equally, an unskillful use might not be to ask enough. So I may have an interest in something and I may want to engage you in that, but perhaps instead of just asking you good questions, I start to tell you what I think you think about it as a way of corroborating my view.
Yeah.
Okay. And suddenly you're not sure what I'm doing. You don't know whether I'm asking you a question, or you don't know whether I'm telling you what you think, even though my motive might be to try to understand what you think. So that's a different facet of being unskillful, the insufficiency of the appropriate voice. The other thing we might do wrongly is we might just ask at the wrong time. Okay, so we could be insensitive. I have an interest in finding out more about your coaching practice, but I don't observe the fact that you seem to be pretty preoccupied with other things. Nonetheless, I pile on in and I start to ask you questions. This is an untimely use of any particular voice and is essentially unskillful. And the judgment about that is based not just on what voice I'm using, but also about, how you are at that period of time, about my ability to judge your interest or propensity in engaging with me at that point in time.
Yeah.
So really skillful use of the voice is about picking the right verbal strategy at the right time, or knowing when to go forward, knowing when to back off. And although that involves more than just an understanding of the voices, unless you can sort of pick and select, unless you think to yourself, do you know, I really need to challenge here, but the time is not right to do that. So actually, I'm just going to ask some questions instead and see where the conversation goes. That's how we move forward with this.
Yeah. I mean, so as I'm listening to you, I mean, that's a lot of information,
Yeah.
it's a lot of information, and I was just telling myself, how do I kind of summarize this in an earthy way and in an earthier way, right? So the way I'm thinking about it, right, Kevin, essentially is this, right? I'm thinking that, look, maybe it's very often, I think, when we talk, and you're right. Very often when we talk, the intentions of our talk is not necessarily being heard, by people whom we are talking to. And, the words that we use all the time, it matters. But actually, it's how we use those words and when do we use those words that truly, truly matter. And I think really Soundwave, has given a lot of people around the world that capability of choosing their words, and knowing how to use them and knowing when to use them, to be able to bring about, the intended effect that they want. And I think that's where this whole idea of, targeting the talk or targeting the conversation, comes about for all of us here, right? And this whole idea of being skillful and unskillful in the way we talk is actually a very fundamental thing in our day-to-day activities with everybody, and it's really important. I want to spend a little bit of time here just unpacking this a little bit for our coaches and for our clients out there, right? So the whole idea is this, right? The way you and I talk does have that ability to impact and influence people in the way they think, in the way they feel, in the way they behave. And I think what I'd like to hear is from you, Kevin, is that, talk to us a little bit about, if we were to skillfully, use the asking voices, if we were to skillfully use, the telling voices or the suggestion voices, right? What would the effect, look like? And I want to bring us back to what we have done this before, right? And if you can see this on the screen here. Now, if we are able to ask skillfully, then we get people around us to think possibilities and solutions. And when we are able to ask skillfully, we get people around us to feel engaged with us. And when we are able to ask skillfully, others begin to act in line with their own thinking. Walk us through this a little bit, Kevin, as to what does this mean in reality for us and for the people that we're interacting with.
Okay, I think there are a couple of things I'd like to say about this, Kim Pong. The first is that on balance, and I have to emphasize that point, on balance, particularly in organizational life, leaders don't ask as much as they probably need to.
Yeah.
So I think we're sort of in line with Peter Senge's original view. We're inquiring enough, but I think we'll just broaden that out a bit because there are some other nuances here. But we don't ask enough, and so we're not really learning enough about how other people are, what their mindset is, what they're thinking, what they're prepared to do. And so, broadly speaking, in organizational life, we could be asking more. And I suspect, but I don't want to be too firm on this, the same is probably true in our relationships outside of work, in our family relationships, in our marriage relationships. I do remember one situation some years ago of a young manager who'd been on one of our training programs, and we'd spent some time looking at asking, in particular looking at inquiring, and he dropped into the workshop a couple of days after we'd finished it and said to me, do you know what? I went home and I sat down and I spoke to my partner and we spent an hour talking. I can't remember the last time we just spent an hour talking. And what made it possible was that I just listened and I asked some questions. And we had the loveliest evening we've had for many, many months. And I think, and that I've always remembered that little story. I mean, we're not in the business of marriage guidance counseling, but the point is, the investment of time with other people generates a connection. That's fundamentally what asking, supported by an interest in the other person, some curiosity about the other person, manages to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And then importantly, if there's any action to be taken, people move forward with higher levels of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll know that from your coaching work.
Mm-hmm.
I could start to talk a lot. I'm just going to pause there for a moment, Kim Pong. Probably enough about asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. As you were talking, actually, I was thinking about my conversations with my wife. So I mean, a lot of what we do here actually exists in the corporate space, but what Soundwave has essentially, it can go from the boardroom into the bedroom too, right? So the whole idea is when I'm talking with my wife, very often I think I do frustrate her unconsciously, by not having that ability to listen. But often I'm trying to correct the conversation, I'm trying to challenge and all that, right? And I think when I begin to understand about this whole idea of asking skillfully, the part that really got to me, right, was the part about how people feel. That if I can be skillful in my ask, the return on investment, or rather the calibrating factor for me, is that my wife should feel engaged with me when she's talking with me, right? That's like the basis of a great conversation. And that really kind of gave me a lot of motivation, Kevin, right, to say, okay, let's learn how to ask better questions. Let's learn how to listen better, right? Instead of trying to jump in midstream and trying to patronize her or ignore her conversation or even destroy her conversation in this respect here. All right, cool. So that's asking, right? Now let's go into the second category here, right? Which is to suggest skillfully. Now, to suggest skillfully is to get other people to think broadly, to get other people to feel involved with our conversation, and to get others to act participatively with us here. So walk us through a little bit on this, Kevin, as to when you are coaching people, when you're working with teams around the world, how does this skillful suggestion capability showcase itself in the lives and outcomes of the people that you work with in the corporations as well as in the communities?
Yeah, there's a broad range of styles of suggesting, let me call it that. We've three voices in here, three verbal strategies: advise, advocate, and articulate, and they're really quite different. So I'm going to leave that level until later, but just come up to suggesting. And I'm going to characterize this as, dare I say it, the management trick. Okay, this is what lots of leaders do in organizations, which is they sort of know they can't go around telling people what to do all the time, or they won't be engaged. Equally, they don't necessarily want to invest the time in asking, because that means a long conversation and no one has time for any of that. So there's sort of this middle ground, whereas we put forward ideas to other people, we make some suggestions to people, sometimes disguised as a question. And if we're compliant, we might imagine ourselves to be hearing a question. And some people do that, even though it's strictly speaking not an ask. And so this is the big management trick, to suggest rather than ask and rather than tell. So having said that, it's also fair to say there are good reasons and there are good occasions to do this. I think the best example and the voice which is strongest in this space of suggesting is the voice to advise. And the advisory voice is around us all the time, and we really need this. In a world where there is a lot of expertise, the division of labor is so complex in modern society, there's no point in me trying to work out for myself what the legal angle is on the particular problem that I'm facing. It is much more effective of me to go and speak to a lawyer and say, can you just give me the answer? I haven't got time to work this out for myself, or to spend 4 years training as a lawyer. It's a really, really essential part of what we do. So when it's done well, when suggestion is done well, and it's left as an option for somebody to choose to progress or not to progress on their own terms is essentially the time saver.
Mm.
That's the fundamental benefit of suggesting. It saves us hours and hours and hours of having to work things out for themselves.
Wow. I've never really quite heard that part before, like saving time by using the suggestion voices, and now that you talk about it, right? I just recall so many instances that when I use the suggestion voices intentionally, it did in fact save a lot of time. So, for example,
Yeah.
one of my favorite voices that I love to use in suggestion. By the way, suggestion, the three voices, just for the benefit of our audience here, right? It is about articulate, advise, and advocate, right? And one of my favorite voices here that I begin to pay a lot more attention to, more notice on, essentially is the articulate voice. And the articulate voice is really about, we're going to talk about that in a series later on, right? But the articulate voice really is about the voice of influence, isn't it? And the ability to kind of capture whatever people are saying and using the articulate voice to read back to them, to describe back to them, it really helped people felt that they are being heard by me, right? And even if I take an opposing view or a very different stance to whatever they're talking about, because of the skillful use of the articulate voice, my gosh, Kevin, you're right. People, they just decided, well, let's not fight with Kim Pong over the differences here. I mean, I hear where he's coming from. Let's talk about, how can we, agree or disagree more productively better together, right? So yeah, I mean, so I never thought of it this way until today as we're talking. So I love that. Learn something brand new today. Let's go back, to the final verbal style here, right? And that essentially is the tell cluster, right? And within the tell, there are the three voices of critique, correct, and challenge. So if we are able to tell skillfully, we get others to think with clarity. We get people to feel respected. Now that was really interesting for me when I realized this, right? And the last part was they get others to act in line with with our expectations, right? So Kevin, walk us through this.
So again, we've got a fairly broad category. The three voices in there are all quite different, doing slightly different things. We'll come on to that. But the tell category are the combination of voices which are really moving us away from what we might be inclined to do. I've sometimes, and it's a little controversial, I've sometimes thought of the telling voices as a sort of contesting set of voices. They move people potentially in a contrary direction from the direction in which they're currently moving. But they are fundamentally designed to get us to work to the demands or the requirements of somebody else or another group of people. So, we can challenge people very directly so that they move in a very different direction or do something very different. We can correct people, in line with expectations or rules, and we can critique. We can point out what it is evaluatively that people are doing that's sort of working or not working. Now, all of these voices have an edge. That to tell somebody what to do has an edge. Particularly, and you and I talk about this in quite humorous terms, actually, Kim Pong, but the difference between Oriental and Occidental cultures comes through here. Nobody in the West likes to be told what to do. Our immediate reaction, and I realize I'm generalizing, is to push back, to become defensive, to ask the question, who do you think you are? I can make up my own mind. And I think in our conversations, we've determined that that's not necessarily true the world over. You might want to say about that in a minute. But for this reason, the use of the telling voice has to be done very sensitively, with a high degree of skill. If we want these voices to land, and if we want this style to land, because often there's good reason for it, our current pandemic situation is a case in point, we need to find ways of making it possible for people to hear what we're saying. And we sometimes hear an unskillful use of the telling voices. They come across too strongly, too harshly, too dogmatically. And we can still be very clear. I mean, you picked up the point of respect, actually, Kim Pong. So actually, if we tell people what to do very clearly, very simply, then people do feel respected. People do feel that, particularly in a situation where they may be at risk of something,
Mm-hmm.
and we're saying do this rather than that, and the risk for you reduces. This is a highly respectful thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'll pause before I move into mumbo jumbo land and give you a time to be earthy again.
Yeah, as you're talking about respect, right? It was probably the greatest discovery for me in the telling voices here, because I think for me, I really dislike, being told by people whom I never asked, for them to tell me anything. People just they just kind of download on me, and honestly, there's no respect in that, right? And the truth is, I never really quite associate the feeling of respect to people telling me, right? And that was something that really caught my attention, and go like, my gosh, if we actually have that ability to tell skillfully, if we know, how to use that voice with the right, use that particular telling voice, with the right people in the right place, under the right circumstances, my gosh, people actually can feel respected because of that, and that, my gosh, is a game changer, and it changes fundamentally, everything that we're doing in terms of, engaging leaders, engaging team members, engaging clients, engaging, our loved ones and all that, right? And you talk about the Occidental and the Asian culture. In the Asian culture, very often subconsciously, I think, and again, I think I'm generalizing here, and I do not want to be kind of nailed down, for what I'm about to say, but essentially, I think in the Asian culture, sometimes we do not know how to ask, but we love to be told, right? And I think, being able to, and being able to tell people sometimes, somehow that respect idea doesn't really quite come across for me, right? So when I come across Soundwave and go like, wow, this is actually something that could happen, this idea of respect, mind blown here. Let's just move on in the what I call that, in the essence of time here, right? So I'm interested in the story from you, Kevin, right? So tell us a personal story, tell us a personal aha moment, because of your sound wave, right? That you have, right? Tell our folks here in this room here, what what is something that kind of got you, noticing that, my gosh, it's the way I talk that really changed everything around here, right? What's your story?
So I think this is the Frankenstein's monster story. So having created Soundwave, I needed to obviously do Soundwave on myself, the self-perception, and also a 360.
Mm-hmm.
And there were two things. I did the self-perception first of all, and curiously enough, although create the concept, produce questionnaires, you don't quite know what the outcome will be.
Yeah.
And so the thing that really struck me was how strong my critiquing preference was.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got my 360 results, actually how much that moved into the accentuated space. So critique became criticism. Now I know how damaging criticism can be. And it was a bit of a wake-up moment, because I suddenly, although I knew I had this capacity to be a bit pointed, a bit acerbic, a bit critical, and sometimes very volubly so, the data actually presented me with the mirror. The data said, hang on a minute, you need to be rather more careful about this than you are. So whilst because I'm human, amazing enough, so I can't pretend that I've completely curbed that tendency, but I do have it much more under control. I do think much more carefully now about the extent to which I really want to take something apart and upset the situation, and so that's really been my wake up moment from sound. It's operated a bit like a mirror. It's told me what I sort of knew about myself, but it's elaborated. It's just presented the situation to me much more clearly than I had understood it previously.
Wow, that's cool. Well, and like you, right? I think my wake up moment was when I realized, uh, the voice that I tend to overuse a lot, and that has given me a lot of success, but at the same time, it's given me a lot of misery. Uh, and I've done my Brilliance 3, my Soundwave Brilliance 3 assessment before, and my top three voices, Kevin, is inquire, probe, and advocate. Now, one of the interesting things that I realize about myself is, when I am, talking to clients, right, my advocate voice is extremely visible and strong, right? So if I'm, really prepared in a conversation and I kind of know, how I want to use the advocate voice, I am actually quite effective with it. But it's moments where I'm actually quite ill prepared, or moments whereby I'm not really thinking too much about what we call a verbal strategy, right? And I'm just going into the conversation thinking that, yeah, I kind of know the content, I know the topic, I know the people, we'll just talk, right? And this is where a lot of time it gets me, right, into the negative space here, which is I begin to use my advocate voice in pitching to my clients. And the more questions that they ask me, instead of answering those questions, I do more advocacy, right? And it just kept going and going and going. And before I knew it, I realized that I was being long-winded. I was all over the place. I was over preachy in whatever I was doing. And I realized, for a moment, that, my gosh, it is this unawareness of, my top voices that is leading me in the charge, as opposed me using my top voices that lead me in my intentions. You know what I'm saying? So I think that was for me, that biggest aha moment in the use of these voices here. And that's why, I love what we are doing here, Kevin. Soundwave literally is, because of, what we are doing. We are helping millions of people around the world, to change their relationship, to change their engagement, to change their perspective, right? One voice at a time, literally. Now, time is almost up here, and I want to kind of tap in one last piece here before, we end this particular episode here. And the question is this: what would be your best advice, right, for people who wants to have more skillful dialogue in their life, for people who wants to be, to be better, right, in the way they communicate with one another? So I'm just asking for one really, really good advice from you. What would that be?
Become aware. Become aware. Understand how you talk.
Mm-hmm.
Simple as that. Get to first base. Increase your awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great advice, and I was hoping that you give that advice. So for those of us, right, who have already done the assessments, I think you know what we are talking about. You know that when we realize how we talk, we actually know its impact, and we actually can change the way we talk. And for those of us, who are out there and you somehow stumble onto our program, you're wondering, gosh, how do I know my voice, right? Well, actually, you can go to the Soundwave website and do a very simple assessment called the Brilliance 3 assessment, right? And here's a very quick a QR code here that you can kind of scan, and it'll bring you to the website and give you a little bit more information on what the Brilliance 3 is all about. And you could do the assessment for a really, really inexpensive cost of about £20, right? So do that. So once again, before I let everybody go, remember, right, subscribe to the channel here so that you get access to all the episodes. And if you want us to notify you, go ahead, click on the bell, and then we will send you the notification every time we post the episodes here. Now, there are altogether 10 episodes in the series. This is the first of all 10, and we have 9 more to go. And if, for all the information you want to find out about Soundwave, the subscription, the Brilliance 3, go ahead, and look out for the links, in the description box at the bottom here. It should be able to bring you to the information that you want. So with that, coaches, friends, fans, and people who just stumble in, thank you for this. And and thank you, Kevin, right? It's a great pleasure always, right, to hang out with my my friend from Bristol, right? And if you notice, guys, right, he is like super duper snazzy with his suit and collar and checker shirt and all that, you know. And me, it's in my t-shirt and my sweatshirt here. And I think we kind of hang out well together, isn't it, Kevin? I think we're okay.
It works.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah, cool. So with that, everybody, I want to say goodbye. Remember, you know, we can actually skillfully use our voices to target our talk, so that we can shift our dialogue, change our conversation, and shift the culture and outcome that we want. All right, take care, everybody. Kevin, I'll see you sometime soon. Really, bye bye. Take care.
Lim Kim Pong. Bye bye.
Bye bye.